On the night of April the 10th in the year 1939, beneath the shimmering chandeliers of the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles, a woman stood radiant and unyielding. In her hands rested a second, golden statue, the prize of the Academy, the recognition of a world that had so often doubted her. Yet her smile, fixed beneath painted lips, was sharp as a blade, and behind it swirled tempests of suspicion and fury that no ovation could calm. In that moment, Bette Davis became not merely a performer, but a sovereign, a queen among shadows, her eyes as unblinking as the lamps that burned upon the stage. And yet, as with all monarchs, her throne was not built upon peace, but upon endless battles, and the applause of that night rang hollow in the corridors of her private soul. Welcome, gentle listener, to the tale of this queen of feuds, a tale meant not to startle you awake, but to guide you into quiet thought as night deepens. Before we begin the long journey, I invite you to tell us in the comments where and when you are listening. In this way, we shall weave a great tapestry of memory, threads stretching across oceans and decades, each voice joined in silent companionship. And should you wish to support the continuation of these ancient stories, press the subscribe button so that the past may linger in the present a little longer. The first breath of Ruth Elizabeth Davis, who would later call herself Bet, came in the chill of a New England spring. It was April in Lowell, Massachusetts, in the year 1908, and the town was still touched by the sooty remnants of the Industrial Revolution. Her father, a lawyer of scholarly leanings, and her mother, a woman of restless ambition and artistic temperament, brought forth a child who would soon learn the jagged sound of quarrels. For theirs was not a peaceful household, and the air of Lowell, which carried the faint odor of mills and damp river stone, was heavy with discontent. It is often asked whether greatness is born of nurture or wound. For Bette Davis, the wound came early, carved by the separation of her parents, a girl raised not by harmony but by fracture, by the sight of her mother forging a path alone, determined that her daughters would never be diminished. Bette watched, and perhaps something fierce grew in her heart, a vow never to bow, never to yield. She was restless in childhood, quick of mind and sharper of tongue than was deemed proper for a young girl. Stories tell that her gaze unsettled even in youth, for her eyes, wide and unflinching, gave the impression not of childish wonder, but of unsparing judgment. Eyes that seemed to see what others wished concealed. Later, these eyes would become legend, celebrated in song and etched into cinema as unforgettable. Yet in those first years they were perhaps a burden for children shy from mirrors that do not flatter. Her education began in small schools of New England, places of strict order where the smell of chalk and ink mingled with the weight of tradition. She did not always excel, as was expected, but she had something more volatile, a presence that teachers both admired and feared. In the evenings, she found comfort in books, in the soft crackle of pages, and in imagining herself beyond the narrow streets of Lowell. Her mother, Ruth Augusta, often called Ruthie, encouraged her artistic inclinations, for she, too, had harbored dreams once thwarted. They spoke often of theater, of performance, and of the world that might await beyond their confines. Thus the idea of stage life began not as escape, but as inheritance, passed from mother to daughter like a torch. When she was still young, her parents' union collapsed entirely. Her father departed, and his absence left a hollow space in her life. She would later speak of him with a mixture of bitterness and detachment, never forgiving, yet never entirely forgetting. In his absence, her mother guided the household with a determined hand. She moved the family, she made decisions, she pressed her daughters towards self-reliance. Bette learned from her mother's resilience a lesson that would shape her destiny, that one must fight, even if the battle wounds. and fight she would, with studios, with rivals, with husbands, and even with her own flesh and blood. As adolescence approached, Bette attended Cushing Academy, a preparatory school in Massachusetts. It was here that the first glimmers of her theatrical spirit found form. School plays, modest in staging and simple in dialogue, became her testing ground. Those who watched her performances noticed not perfection, but intensity, a quality difficult to define. She did not simply recite lines. She inhabited them with a seriousness that unsettled. Even when speaking trivial roles, she made audiences lean forward. Perhaps it was here that she first understood her difference. While others sought applause for charm, she drew notice for truth, however unflattering. In the halls of Cushing, with their wooden floors echoing footsteps, she also began to sense the solitude of ambition. Few companions matched her fervor, and she found herself isolated. Yet solitude often sharpens resolve. She began to dream not of a safe existence, but of something greater, something that might etch her name into the firmament of memory. It is said she once told a friend that she would never be ordinary. Was it boast, or was it prophecy whispered by the fates themselves? From Cushing, she traveled to New York, where the great theaters of Broadway beckoned like stars beyond fog. She enrolled in drama school, where she was trained in the classic styles of diction and movement. The room smelled of sweat and dust, and the voices of instructors rang with severity. They demanded precision, yet Bette resisted polish. She preferred jagged edges, gestures that did not soothe but provoked. Some teachers criticized her lack of glamour, others praised her rawness. Yet she remained certain of her course, though certainty often cloaks doubt. She shed her birth name Ruth Elizabeth, choosing instead the harder, sharper Bette. Names, like masks, carry power. In her new name, perhaps she armored herself against the softness of her past. Yet still, the road was uncertain. The city was crowded with hopeful actresses, each adorned with beauty, each willing to bend to studio demands. Bette was neither the most beautiful nor the most compliant. She carried within her the paradox of strength and insecurity. She longed to be chosen, yet recoiled from compromise. And so her journey began with rejection upon rejection, her face deemed too severe, her manner too abrupt. She persevered nonetheless, each no sharpening her will, until at last the gates of Hollywood opened, though only slightly. She arrived in California in 1930, stepping into a land bathed in light so different from the gray stone of New England. Yet the sunshine concealed a machinery colder than any New England winter, the studio system, vast and indifferent, where dreams were processed into profit. Executives looked upon her with skepticism. Too plain, they said, not enough allure. They saw not a goddess, but an ordinary girl with fierce eyes, and yet within those eyes flickered a defiance that would not be extinguished. The palm leaves swayed under the mild winds of California nights, and young Bette, still half stranger to this new land, felt the air unlike the heavy gray skies of Massachusetts. There was a sweetness in the scent of orange blossoms, and a false promise that the earth here would be softer, kinder. Yet in truth, the ground of Hollywood was stony, paved not with blossoms but with contracts inked in iron. The studio gates through which she passed were guarded not only by men but by standards that bent only for certain faces, certain bodies, certain women who wore obedience as their second skin. She was not one of them. Her eyes, sharp as glass, betrayed a mind unwilling to yield. She entered as if to a battlefield, though she could not yet see how long and treacherous the war would become. The early days in Hollywood were filled with humiliations disguised as opportunities. She was tested for roles and dismissed before she could even speak. Some directors laughed quietly when she turned her head, saying she lacked the soft curve of glamour. Executives whispered that she was too Yankee, too plain, too serious. They wanted girls whose eyes melted, whose smiles surrendered. Betty's gaze held too much defiance, and her lips, when pressed, seemed to conceal judgment rather than charm. Yet she endured, enduring as her mother had, holding her ground though the soil beneath her seemed designed to push her out. It is often said that destiny hides in small corners, waiting to be noticed. For Bette, the corner appeared in her relentless training, in the hours spent observing those who had already succeeded, studying not only how they spoke, but how they controlled silence. She mimicked nothing, yet she absorbed everything. She saw how the camera, with its unblinking stare, sought truth even when the studios demanded lies. And so she chose not to seduce the camera with softness, but to challenge it, to meet its gaze as an equal adversary. Few understood then what power this would bring her. During these early years, she also began reshaping her very identity. Her given name, Ruth Elizabeth, too gentle, too heavy with the past, was gradually stripped away. She cut herself from childhood with a single blade of renaming, Bette. It was a choice inspired by Balzac's La Cousine Bette, a character known for cunning and perseverance. There is mystery in the act of naming oneself. Is it an escape or a declaration? Did Bette choose the name to armor her wounds or to summon a destiny she believed already inscribed in the stars? Such questions have no certain answer, but we can feel their resonance in the way she spoke it. Bette, clipped, sharp, unsoftened, as if demanding attention even when uninvited. Yet her battles were not only with strangers. Within herself raged storms of doubt. She knew she was not conventionally beautiful, and in the corridors of Hollywood that truth was repeated like a curse. But perhaps this doubt became her secret weapon. For instead of depending upon beauty, she leaned into force. She crafted performances that could not be ignored. She chose roles that clung to the bone, that made the audience uneasy. In this way, rejection became her anvil, doubt her hammer, and from them she forged an identity stronger than the fleeting allure of beauty. By 1931, she secured small parts, barely noticed by the public. She stood often at the edges of frames, a secretary, a young woman passing in the background. But even then, directors found themselves drawn back to her takes, noticing how she infused even trivial roles with a weight that other actresses would waste. The camera, so indifferent to charm, seemed to recognize her defiance. In those moments, she began to believe that though the gatekeepers of Hollywood might sneer, the lens itself could not lie. Life in Los Angeles was not kind to her spirit. She had left behind her New England restraint, but she found no easy companionship in the new city. The sun was too bright, the smiles too rehearsed, the promises too fragile. She spent long evenings in solitude, writing letters home, wondering if the dream was worth the hunger, gnawing at her resolve. Yet she stayed, compelled by something beyond ambition. Perhaps it was fate, or perhaps it was the stubborn echo of her mother's teachings. Never surrender, even when the world commands you to. It was during this period that she began to think deeply about performance, not as imitation but as revelation. She would later speak of acting as truth-telling, the excavation of layers until something raw emerged. Even as a young woman, struggling for recognition, she rehearsed in her mind roles not yet offered. She would imagine herself as the cruel lover, the bitter rival, the broken soul. She practiced not to enchant, but to disturb, to unsettle. Was it foresight or simply instinct that guided her away from the shallow paths offered to most women of her era? We cannot know. We only see, in hindsight, that her rebellion began even before she had power to wield it. Her first husband, Harmon Nelson, came into her life in these early years. Their union was passionate but fragile, marked by differences in ambition. She sought greatness. He, perhaps, sought companionship. When she pursued her career with relentless devotion, he felt neglected, diminished. The marriage fractured, another echo of her parents' separation. Once again, she learned that devotion to art often demands sacrifices no heart can sustain. And yet, instead of softening, she grew sharper. Heartbreak became fuel, another lesson etched into her will. Love could wound, but work, at least, remained faithful. Her persistence brought her to Warner Brothers, the studio where she would rise in battle, triumph and rage. At first, they treated her like any other contract player, assigning her roles beneath her talent. She played forgettable women in forgettable films, characters written as adornments to male stars. Still, she gave them depth, infusing their shallow lines with bitterness or irony. Slowly, the audiences noticed. Slowly, the critics began to whisper that here was something different. A young actress unafraid to be plain, unafraid to be cruel, unafraid to show the shadows most others concealed. The turning point would come soon, but in these first years, it was only a seed beneath the soil, unseen yet inevitable. She walked across studio lots, her eyes taking in everything: the painted sets, the artificial rain, the laughter of executives. And beneath the laughter, she heard the grinding gears of power, the machinery that reduced human souls to contracts. She knew already that she would fight this machinery, though she had not yet gathered the weapons. She carried herself with an air that unsettled the powerful, as if she saw through their facades. And perhaps she did. As the days of the early 30s stretched into nights of doubt and resolve, she became more certain of her course. Others might fade, might return home, might abandon the dream. She would not. She lingered, watching the palm leaves sway, listening to the hum of the city, and whispering once again to herself that she would not be ignored. The vow grew stronger with each rejection until it became not merely ambition, but destiny. Twilight lingered upon the Warner Brothers lot, the glow of artificial lamps bleeding into the fading orange of the California sky. Bette Davis stood there, still a figure on the margins, her presence noted but not yet believed in, her footsteps carrying her deeper into a place that had yet to grant her true belonging. The echo of her vow that she would not be ignored carried softly against the hum of machinery and distant rehearsals. And it was in those quiet evenings, after days of trivial roles and half-hearted recognition, that the seed of her breakthrough began to stir. Hollywood in the early 30s was a kingdom ruled by glamour. Stars were polished like jewels, their imperfections ground away until nothing remained but surfaces that reflected studio light. The men in charge, cigar smoke curling around their words, did not yet imagine that audiences might hunger for rawness, for brutality, for the bitterness of reality. They thought audiences wanted only the sheen of fantasy. Bette, sharp-eyed and unyielding, carried in her the storm of another kind of performance, one that unsettled instead of soothing. Yet she had no place for such art until fate, disguised as rejection by others, offered her the role of a lifetime. It came in 1934, when Warner Brothers cast her in a film adaptation of W. Somerset Maugham's Of Human Bondage. The story of a crippled man destroyed by his obsession with a cruel, vulgar waitress had been shunned by many actresses. They feared the role of Mildred Rogers, a woman mean-spirited, unrefined, vicious in her petty cruelties. It was not the kind of part that secured glamour or guaranteed adoration. But Bette, whose hunger was never for easy applause, seized it with both hands. Here, at last, was a chance to display the very intensity she had been told was a flaw. Here was a role where her sharpness would not only fit, but burn. When the cameras rolled, she transformed. Gone was the polished Hollywood facade. She delivered Mildred with unflinching honesty, sneering, spitting words like shards of broken glass. Her face twisted with malice, rather than softened with charm. The audience, accustomed to heroines of sweetness and grace, was confronted with ugliness that could not be turned aside. Critics recoiled at first, then marveled. They saw in her not simply an actress performing cruelty, but a woman willing to show herself stripped of vanity. In Mildred Rogers, Bette Davis declared to the world that truth mattered more than beauty, that performance could wound as deeply as it could soothe. The role transformed her from the margins of Warner Brothers into a force impossible to deny. Yet even in triumph, shadows lingered. For some, her daring was admired, but for others, it was unsettling, almost dangerous. The studios, forever cautious of their audiences, fretted that she was too fierce, too harsh, too unwilling to soften her edges. And here we pause to ask, is it possible for brilliance to be welcomed by a world that fears its sharpness? Or must every artist of unyielding truth be condemned to walk always at the edge of exile? The success of human bondage did not immediately free her from struggle. Though critics began to sing her name, Warner Brothers still sought to mold her into their pattern, to press her into roles of lesser substance. She was cast again and again in films unworthy of her talent, women written as adornments, characters without depth. Each role felt to her like a betrayal, each script a cage. Her frustration grew, and within her, the fire of rebellion ignited. She was not content to be a jewel in the studio's crown. She wished to be the crown itself, unbreakable and sovereign. In these years, her temperament became both her weapon and her burden. She quarreled with directors, clashed with producers, and spoke her mind where others swallowed their words. She carried within her a conviction that an actress should not simply obey, but should shape the very art itself. Her sharp tongue earned her enemies, yet also set her apart. In the silence of her home, she sometimes wondered if she had chosen a path that would leave her forever embattled. But even in doubt, she never stepped back. To yield would have been to betray the vow she had made beneath those palm leaves years before. Her personal life reflected these battles as well. Harmon Nelson, her husband, grew increasingly uneasy with her rising fame and her relentless devotion to work. Their union cracked under the weight of ambition, and soon it was broken entirely. For Bette, love often clashed with career, and career always won. One wonders if she sought in men what she already carried within herself, a fire too consuming to be shared, and when they failed to contain it, she turned back to the stage, where at least her fire was transformed into art rather than resentment. The struggle for better roles reached its peak when she attempted what few actors of her time dared. She sued Warner Brothers, demanding the right to refuse inferior scripts. The case, fought in English courts, was lost, yet the echo of her defiance carried across Hollywood. Though defeated in law, she triumphed in spirit, for she became the actress who dared to defy the very system that ruled them all. Others, though silent, took heart in her rebellion, and though she returned to Warner Brothers still bound by contract, her power had grown. No longer could they dismiss her as ordinary. She had forced them to recognize her worth, even if only grudgingly. It is here, in the mid-30s, that we see the figure of Bette Davis fully beginning to take shape. An actress unafraid to be unattractive on screen, unafraid to challenge her masters, unafraid to sacrifice comfort for principle. Yet what price does such a life demand? Fame, yes. Immortality, perhaps, but also loneliness, bitterness, the endless shadow of conflict. And so the question lingers, does greatness always bear within it the seed of self-destruction? As the decade moved toward its close, she stood upon the threshold of her first true crown. In 1936, she received her first Academy Award for Dangerous, a recognition many believed owed more to apology for her exclusion from of human bondage than to the performance itself. Still, the golden statue shone in her hands, a symbol of the world's reluctant acknowledgement. Yet even in victory, she felt the sting of suspicion. Was the honor earned or granted as consolation? Such doubt lingered in her, gnawing at the triumph. Perhaps this is the fate of those who fight too fiercely, that even victory tastes of ash. The golden statue stood upon the mantel, its metallic surface gleaming in the low lamplight, a figure both triumphant and mocking. Bette Davis, gazing upon it in the solitude of her home, could not be certain whether it marked true victory or a hollow gesture from an industry that sought to tame her spirit. Outside, the faint rumble of Los Angeles automobiles drifted through the windows, a reminder that life continued heedless of golden trophies. Inside, the silence was heavy, filled with questions only she could hear. Yet silence, though sharp, did not break her resolve. She turned from the mantelpiece not with gratitude, but with renewed determination. If the world doubted her worth, she would prove it again and again, until there could be no doubt. The year 1939 brought such proof, for it was the year of Jezebel. In this role, Davis unleashed her fullest power, embodying Julie Marsden, a Southern belle whose vanity and defiance led to ruin. It was a role steeped in passion and venom, a woman flawed and unrepentant, and it fit her as though written upon her very skin. In Jezebel, she shed the lingering uncertainty of earlier years. Her performance seared itself into audiences' memories, for she played not a heroine to be admired, but a woman to be feared, pitied, and remembered. To embody such complexity required courage, and Davis had it in abundance. The Academy bestowed upon her its highest honor once more, and this time the applause, though still tinged with envy and whispers, could not conceal the truth. She had arrived as a sovereign force. Her triumph in Jezebel came in the same year as another towering spectacle, Gone with the Wind. Some would later say that Jezebel had been offered to Davis as a kind of compensation for losing the role of Scarlett O'Hara. Others whispered that Julie Marsden was her own Scarlett, a mirror in which she could prove her worth against the towering legend of Vivien Leigh. But in the end, such comparisons mattered little, for what Bette achieved in Jezebel was distinct, singular, unreplicable. While Leigh's Scarlett danced with charm and selfishness, Davis's Julie burned with destructive pride, her defiance unsoftened by romance. One wonders whether Davis, in playing Julie, was revealing something of herself, a woman who would rather ruin herself than bow to the will of others. The victory of Jezebel did not soften her life off-screen. By now, she had fully earned her reputation as difficult, a word that clung to her as stubbornly as perfume. She quarreled with Warner Brothers executives, pressing them for roles that matched her talent. She rejected scripts that insulted her intelligence, demanded directors who would challenge her, and scorned the endless procession of trivial romances offered to actresses of her era. These battles made her feared, sometimes despised, but also respected. Few women of her generation dared to wield such defiance, and fewer still survived it. Yet Davis, for all the storms she conjured, seemed almost to thrive within them. Her private life mirrored the turbulence of her career. In 1940, she married Arthur Farnsworth, a New England innkeeper whose steadiness seemed at first a balm against her restless soul. But even this union would not last. Farnsworth's sudden death in 1943 left her shattered, though she rarely allowed the public to see the depth of her grief. Behind the sharp eyes and sharp tongue lay a woman who had endured abandonment as a child, rejection as an actress, and now loss as a wife. Did these wounds harden her, or did they deepen the well from which she drew her art? Perhaps both, for her performances in these years carried a resonance of sorrow mingled with defiance, as if she was saying to the world, "Life has cut me, but I remain standing." The early 40s also saw her transformation into more than an actress. She became a figure of cultural duty. During the Second World War, she helped found the Hollywood Canteen, a refuge for soldiers where stars served food, danced, and brought brief comfort to men preparing for battle. Davis, with sleeves rolled, served tirelessly, her sharpness now directed into service. Yet even here, in an act of generosity, there lingered her restless will. She ran the canteen with an authority that left no room for slackness, scolding those who did not give enough, demanding commitment as fierce as her own. Compassion and severity, generosity and command. She embodied contradictions that made her both loved and feared. But even as the war years passed, Hollywood itself remained an uneasy partner. Warner Brothers continued to exploit her fame while resisting her demands. Their quarrels became legendary. She fought over roles, refused scripts, and threatened departure. To the public, these battles painted her as temperamental. To those who understood her, they revealed a woman who refused to let her art be diminished. In truth, Davis was not fighting for herself alone. She was fighting for all women who wished to be seen not as ornaments but as full human beings upon the screen. The echoes of her defiance would ripple long after her own battles were done, though in her time they brought her isolation. Her performances in this era, films such as The Letter and now Voyager, deepened her reputation. In these roles, she explored the shadows of jealousy, repression, and desire with a rawness that few dared. Audiences, even as they recoiled, could not turn away. She held them captive, forcing them to confront truths they preferred hidden. There is mystery in this power. How can one woman, framed by celluloid, command the gaze of millions? Perhaps because she did not flatter them, but mirrored them. She revealed cruelty, longing, weakness, and pride, qualities audiences recognized but dared not confess. The end of the 30s and the dawning of the 40s thus marked not only her greatest triumph, but the cementing of her legend. Yet even as her crown gleamed, its edges were sharp. For every victory was accompanied by feud, for every role won, a battle fought. And in the quiet of her nights, one wonders if she asked herself whether the struggle was worth the wounds. Did she crave peace, or was conflict itself her lifeblood? Perhaps like Julie Marsden of Jezebel, she knew no other way to live than to defy, even if defiance destroyed her. Her hand hovered over the golden statue and then withdrew, as though the weight of victory might burn her skin. She leaned back in her chair, the glow of the bulbs framing her reflection in twin shadows, and in that moment, she must have known that the battles behind her had only sharpened the edge of those still to come. The applause faded in the theater beyond, but within her chest another sound rose, the restless beating of a heart unwilling to accept compromise. For though she had triumphed in Jezebel, though she had earned the gleaming prize on the mantle, Warner Brothers continued to bind her in chains of ink and paper, contracts that dictated not only her work, but the very contours of her spirit. The war between actress and studio was entering its fiercest hour. The studio system of the 1930s and 1940s was a kingdom of gilded cages. Actors were signed to long-term contracts, their lives micromanaged by executives who viewed them less as artists than as commodities to be bought and sold, cast and discarded. For men, the bonds were heavy. For women, they were suffocating. Most yielded. They smiled, accepted roles that flattered but diminished, and took their fortunes in silence. But Bette Davis, sharp-eyed and unyielding, refused. She'd given them hits, she'd given them prestige, yet still they thrust upon her scripts that insulted her intelligence. She read these roles with growing fury, lines that reduced women to ornaments, to foils, to shadows beside men. And she said no. Her refusals escalated into quarrels, quarrels into ultimatums, and at last into open rebellion. In 1936, she did the unthinkable. She left Hollywood entirely and fled across the Atlantic to England, seeking freedom upon foreign soil. There, she declared war upon Warner Brothers in the courts of London, suing for release from her contract. She argued that the studio had failed her, that they had shackled her to mediocrity, that no artist should be compelled to betray their craft. It was a battle no actress had fought so publicly, and the world watched with fascination. Newspapers covered the spectacle, the headlines painting her as both heroine and ingrate. Some admired her courage, others condemned her arrogance, but none could deny the audacity of her stand. In the oak-paneled chambers of the English court, the case was fought with solemnity. The judges listened, the lawyers argued, and across the Atlantic, the studio magnates sneered. The law, bound by precedent and power, did not favor her. She lost. The contract held. She was ordered back to Warner Brothers, her rebellion seemingly crushed. Yet though the verdict was against her, the spirit of her defiance lingered like thunder after lightning. For in losing, she had revealed to the world that the cage was not inviolable. She had spoken aloud what others dared only whisper, that the system was unjust, that actors were more than commodities, that art itself demanded freedom. Returning to Hollywood, she walked once more through the studio gates, but she was no longer merely a contract player. She was the actress who had dared to defy Jack Warner himself, who had crossed an ocean to fight for her dignity. Warner Brothers could not erase this act, and though they forced her back into their service, they granted her roles more fitting of her power. And so, paradoxically, her defeat was also her victory. She had lost in law but won in legend. The name Bette Davis now carried with it the weight of rebellion, a defiance that audiences could sense even when she stood silently upon the screen. The years that followed brought her some of her most celebrated roles. Jezebel had crowned her, but films like Dark Victory and The Letter deepened her reign. In these roles, she embodied women of complexity, proud, flawed, wounded, and unrepentant. No longer the shallow characters the studio had once pressed upon her, these women echoed with depth. Each performance was a mirror of her battles, a reflection of a woman who had fought for the right to play truth. And the audiences responded, not merely with admiration, but with a kind of recognition. They saw in her a defiance that resonated with their own unspoken longings. Yet for Bette, victories in art never fully softened the bitterness of struggle. The war with Warner Brothers continued in endless skirmishes, each role negotiated like territory, each script contested like a battlefield. She became known not only for her performances, but for her temper, her insistence, her refusal to yield. The word difficult grew ever more attached to her name, but perhaps difficult was only another word for unyielding. And perhaps unyielding was the only path for a woman who sought not just to survive Hollywood, but to rule it. Her personal life during these years wove its own tapestry of turbulence. The death of Arthur Farnsworth in 1943 left her once again alone, bereft, and hardened. She mourned, though she rarely allowed the public to glimpse her grief. In interviews, she spoke briskly, her voice sharp, her posture regal. Yet behind the mask, sorrow etched itself into her being. She poured this sorrow into her work, her characters shaded with loneliness, her eyes carrying the depth of wounds unhealed. It was said that when she played tragedy, audiences wept not because of the script, but because her own pain seeped through the screen. And yet, amid all this turmoil, she worked tirelessly, her discipline unbroken. She arrived on sets early, prepared, professional, exacting not only of herself, but of others. Directors who faltered under her intensities sometimes resented her, but even they could not deny her mastery. She demanded respect not by charm, but by force, and in doing so, she reshaped the very landscape of Hollywood performance. Where once actresses were measured by their beauty, now they were measured also by their ferocity. She had cracked open the door for a new kind of woman on screen, one defined not by softness but by strength. Still, as the 1940s deepened, the scars of her battles began to show. Fame was hers, power was hers, yet peace eluded her. She had made herself a queen, but a queen besieged, ruling a court of whispers, envy, and endless quarrels. Did she ever long for quiet, for tenderness, for a life less fraught with conflict? Or did the very absence of peace feed the flame that kept her alive? The answer may lie in the way she carried herself, never bowed, never softened, always walking as though the next battle was already upon her. The drizzle clung to her coat as she stepped onto the London pavement, her shoes striking firm against the wet stone, each echo a declaration that defeat would not silence her. She carried with her no trophy from the court, no victory sealed in ink, but the fire within her eyes burned brighter than the gray sky above. By the time she returned across the Atlantic, the world had already altered its gaze. She was no longer simply an actress at Warner Brothers' command. She was Bette Davis, the woman who had dared to bite the hand that fed her, the rebel who had walked into foreign courts to demand her freedom. And though she had been ordered back, though the chains of her contract remained, they now rested upon wrists unwilling to be bowed. Her defiance became part of her legend, stitched into her identity as indelibly as her voice or her eyes. It was in the years just before this bold rebellion that she had first held in her hand the Golden Statue, the Academy Award for Dangerous in 1936. It had been a curious honor. Critics praised her performance as Joyce Heath, the self-destructive actress whose life spiraled toward ruin. Yet many whispered that the award was not given for the role itself, but as belated recognition for her unforgettable turn as Mildred in Of Human Bondage 2 years earlier. Hollywood had overlooked her then, leaving her name absent from the nominations despite a performance that had shaken the very foundations of cinematic expectation. Outrage had spread, letters poured in, and by the time Dangerous appeared, the Academy, perhaps seeking to right a wrong, placed the statue in her hands. Bette understood the weight of this murmur. She had worked for it. She had suffered for it. Yet the shadow of doubt dulled its shine. Was the award hers by merit or by apology? In later years, she would admit she felt the victory had been tainted, that it had not been given for her finest work. But still, the golden figure gleamed on her mantle, a symbol not only of achievement, but of suspicion, of the uneasy marriage between art and recognition. Perhaps that is the fate of all honors, to be both crown and burden, light and shadow at once. The character of Joyce Heath in Dangerous carried with her echoes of Bette's own battles. A woman undone by her own passion, consumed by her refusal to bend, was not so distant from the young actress who quarreled with directors, who railed against mediocrity. When audiences saw Joyce's destruction, did they glimpse also the turmoil of the woman portraying her? Acting for Bette was never mere pretense. It was excavation, the pulling forth of something raw from within her soul. Thus her performances never felt safe, never softened to please. They were jagged mirrors in which audiences could see not only the characters, but themselves, their weaknesses, their pride, their secret wounds. Even as she held the golden statue, she knew her battles with Warner Brothers had only begun. The contract system remained firm, the scripts still piled upon her desk, many of them shallow, trivial, insulting to her intelligence. The war with the studio would define her life as much as any role. Yet with each role she managed to wrest from their grasp, she carved out a new image of womanhood upon the screen. Her characters were not passive beauties, but figures of will, often flawed, often unlikable, yet always unforgettable. She gave to women a new kind of presence in cinema, one that could dominate rather than decorate. In 1939, the same year she triumphed with Jezebel, she stood again at the Academy Awards, holding her second statue. This time, there was no shadow of apology. This was victory earned, recognition of a performance so fierce it could not be denied. 2 statues within 3 years marked her as a queen of the screen, yet queenship brought not peace but new storms. For with each crown came higher expectations, sharper scrutiny, and fiercer envy. Her fellow actresses regarded her with a mixture of admiration and resentment. Studio executives, though they could not ignore her, plotted still to control her. And she herself, restless and relentless, found no satisfaction in laurels already won. For Bette Davis, triumph was never enough. Only the next battle, the next role, the next confrontation would keep the flame alive. Off the screen, her temper became the stuff of legend. She demanded rehearsals be rigorous, that sets run with discipline, that every member of the cast and crew meet her own standards of devotion. She scolded laziness. She dismissed incompetence. She quarreled with directors who faltered, and she left in her wake both admiration and resentment. To some, she was tyrant. To others, savior. But to all, she was unforgettable. Her eyes, when fixed upon someone, could unnerve even the most seasoned professionals. They called them Bette Davis eyes, wide, unblinking, fierce, as though she were stripping away pretense and peering into the marrow of a soul. In her personal life, the storm was no less fierce. Her marriage to Harmon Nelson had ended in bitter rupture, the demands of her career too consuming for love's fragile balance. Loneliness, though she rarely admitted it, haunted her. She longed for companionship, yet her fiery spirit consumed those who drew near. Men were drawn to her brilliance, but many recoiled from the heat of her ambition. She moved through relationships like a warrior through campaigns, her heart both craving tenderness and armored against disappointment. Perhaps she never truly sought peace in love, only a reflection of her own strength, and finding none, she returned always to the only partner who matched her will, her work. The 1940s opened before her with promise and with grief. The death of her second husband, Arthur Farnsworth, in 1943, struck her deeply. Though she rarely spoke of the sorrow, those close to her saw the shadow it cast. Yet even grief she transformed into performance. Films like Now, Voyager, and The Little Foxes revealed a woman who could channel personal torment into art that resonated across oceans. In Charlotte Vale of Now, Voyager, she portrayed a repressed woman who found freedom and love, a story of transformation that moved audiences to tears. And yet behind the fiction lay Bette herself, transformed by wounds into strength, carrying sorrow as though it were both burden and crown. Recognition followed her ceaselessly now, not only in trophies but in the whispers of critics, the awe of audiences, the envy of peers. Yet still she felt the cage of the studio. Though she had wrestled better roles from Warner Brothers, though she had earned their reluctant respect, she remained bound by contract, compelled to fight for each scrap of dignity. Her life became a cycle of triumph and quarrel, victory and feud, applause and bitterness. One wonders if she ever paused to imagine a life without such strife. Could she have been content in obscurity, far from cameras, far from the endless battles? Or was strife itself the air she breathed, without which she could not live? She gazed at the 2 golden statues, their surfaces bright yet cold, their presence both triumphant and mocking, as though they were guardians she neither trusted nor adored. The trophies reflected the fire of her eyes, but could not quiet the restlessness within her chest. They were monuments to victories already won, but Bette Davis was never content with laurels that belonged to yesterday. The night hummed with the rustle of palms, the distant murmur of Los Angeles boulevards, and a question unspoken. What was to come for a woman who had already been crowned, yet hungered for more? The answer arrived not in the form of roles or accolades, but in the presence of another woman whose shadow would soon intertwine with hers in a feud so legendary that even decades later, its embers would still glow. Her name was Joan Crawford. Crawford was in many ways Davis's mirror opposite. Where Bette's edges were sharp and unsoftened, Joan's presence was sculpted into elegance. Crawford was glamour made flesh, a woman who had built herself from poverty into the embodiment of Hollywood allure. Her beauty was refined, her persona carefully curated, her determination concealed beneath layers of charm. But beneath those polished surfaces burned a will as fierce as Davis's own. And when two fires meet, they do not warm, they consume. The tension between them was not born in a single moment, but grew like a storm on the horizon, inevitable once they occupied the same firmament. The first sparks of rivalry were fanned by gossip, for Hollywood thrived upon whispers as much as upon performances. Studios and columnists delighted in comparing the two women, Crawford, the glamorous queen of MGM, and Davis, the sharp-edged rebel of Warner Brothers. They were contrasted not only in style, but in philosophy. Crawford sought control through charm and image, Davis through defiance and truth. Each represented a different path to power, and in their differences the public saw a duel of queens. But rivalry, though exciting to audiences, carries within it poison for those who live it. Their personal animosity deepened when Crawford married Franchot Tone, an actor with whom Davis had been rumored to share affection. Though the truth of this connection remains clouded in speculation, Davis herself admitted to admiration for Tone's intellect and charm. Crawford, with her swift marriage, seemed to Davis less a rival and more an adversary who had stolen a prize she might have cherished. Whether this wound was rooted in love or in pride matters less than the fact that it sharpened the edges of their animosity. Hollywood gossip spread the tale, and what might have been private resentment became public theater. Through the years that followed, the feud simmered like coals beneath ash. They moved in different orbits. Crawford at MGM, Davis at Warner Brothers, yet their names were twined in conversation, their differences compared, their careers measured side by side. Each new triumph of one seemed to provoke a response from the other. Their glances across the crowded rooms of Hollywood gatherings were cool, their words about each other sharp when delivered to the press. To the public, it was delicious spectacle. To the women themselves, it was the weight of pride and the refusal to yield supremacy. Davis's performances in the late 30s and early 40s solidified her reign. Roles like Regina Giddens in The Little Foxes revealed a woman of ruthless ambition, commanding the screen with icy cruelty. Critics marveled, audiences shivered, and Warner Brothers, though still wary of her defiance, acknowledged her power. Crawford, meanwhile, fought her own battles at MGM, reinventing herself again and again, refusing to fade even as younger stars threatened her place. She was glamorous, Davis was raw, yet both shared the same relentless hunger to remain not only relevant, but sovereign. Perhaps it was this shared hunger, more than any personal slight, that made their rivalry inevitable. The world of Hollywood was eager to pit women against one another, for it made headlines and sold tickets. Men could feud quietly, their rivalries hidden in boardrooms and contracts, but women were thrust into the public eye, their conflicts magnified into theater. Davis and Crawford became unwilling actors in a drama written by others, yet their own tempers and pride gave the story fuel. They could have ignored the comparisons, turned away from gossip, but neither woman possessed the temperament for indifference. Indifference is a luxury of the meek, and neither Davis nor Crawford was meek. It was not until the early 1960s, however, that their rivalry would explode into the full blaze of legend. For by then, both women, once queens of the screen, found themselves cast aside by a Hollywood that had little use for aging actresses. Younger stars filled the posters, newer styles dominated the box office, and the roles offered to Davis and Crawford dwindled. Each, proud and unyielding, fought against the fading of their light. And then came the film that would bind them together forever. Whatever happened to baby Jane? The story itself was cruel in its genius. Two aging sisters, locked in a decaying house, bound by resentment, jealousy, and madness. One crippled and dependent, the other deranged and violent. It was a tale that mirrored not only the cruelty of aging, but also the very feud that audiences already whispered about between Davis and Crawford. The casting itself was spectacle. To place these two rivals opposite each other, forced into intimate conflict on screen, was a gamble that paid in both box office success and legend. On set, the feud became flesh. Our stories abound of their battles, of Davis delivering blows a little too forcefully in scenes, of Crawford weighting her body so Davis would struggle to lift her, of whispered insults and public barbs. Some of these tales are fact, some exaggeration, but all of them contributed to the mythology. What is certain is that the animosity between them did not fade, but intensified under the heat of proximity. And yet, paradoxically, their performances were electrified by this hostility. The venom of their rivalry spilled onto the screen, transforming fiction into something disturbingly real. For Davis, playing baby Jane Hudson was an act of fearless defiance. She embraced grotesquerie, painting her face with childish makeup, her eyes wide with madness, her voice shrill with cruelty. She was unafraid to look monstrous, unafraid to strip herself of glamour in pursuit of truth. Crawford, in contrast, clung to dignity, portraying Blanche with wounded restraint, her beauty intact even in suffering. Together, they created a masterpiece of horror and pathos, a film that has endured for decades, not only for its artistry, but for the living feud that crackled within it. When the Academy Award nominations arrived, Davis was honored for her performance. Crawford was not. The sting of exclusion, sharpened by years of rivalry, drove Crawford to her own act of vengeance. She lobbied behind the scenes, aligning herself with other nominees, and on the night of the ceremony, when Davis waited in vain for her name to be called, it was Crawford who stepped onto the stage. Not as winner, but as representative for Anne Bancroft, absent that evening to accept the Oscar in her stead. Dressed in silver, radiant and poised, she took the spotlight that Davis had longed for, and in doing so delivered a blow far sharper than any scene they had played on screen. The cameras captured it, the audience gasped, and history recorded it as one of the most unforgettable moments in the saga of their feud. The night outside the theater was cool, the air fresh with a faint trace of ocean salt drifting inland, but inside, Bette Davis's chest, the heat of humiliation still burned. Crawford's triumphant glide across the stage, her silver gown shimmering under the lights as she cradled a prize meant for another, lingered in Bette's mind like a wound that would never heal. Yet even as the applause faded into memory, Davis knew that the battle with her rival was only one among many, and that life itself, relentless in its demands, would call her to other fields. Long before the spectacle of baby Jane and its aftermath, there had been another stage where Davis had tested her endurance, a stage not of cinema, but of war. The 1940s had pulled her from her private feuds and personal sorrows into the service of something greater, and it was here, during the long years of World War II, that her fire turned outward, burning for a cause that could not be denied. The war arrived in Hollywood first as whispers, then as demands. Young men left their homes, boarding ships and planes, bound for Europe and the Pacific. Their absence left behind women waiting, families grieving, and a nation bracing against fear. Hollywood, with its lights and laughter, seemed at once frivolous and necessary. Films became both escape and propaganda, offering distraction and stirring patriotism. For Davis, who had always believed in truth over illusion, the call to action could not be ignored. She became one of the driving forces behind the creation of the Hollywood Canteen, a haven for servicemen stationed in Los Angeles, a place where stars served food, danced, and provided a fleeting taste of joy before the soldiers returned to the uncertainty of war. The canteen was no shallow gesture. Davis poured herself into its creation with a fervor that astonished even those who had grown used to her intensity. She organized, fundraised, commanded, and worked as though the success of the entire enterprise rested upon her shoulders alone. Alongside John Garfield, she transformed a simple warehouse on Cahuenga Boulevard into a living monument of gratitude. Stars of every stature, from the mighty to the obscure, took their turns serving sandwiches, pouring coffee, and dancing with the young men who might soon be gone forever. Davis herself, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, worked tirelessly, her voice sharp in command, her eyes unyielding in expectation. She demanded that her fellow stars give as much as she did, and when they faltered, she scolded without mercy. For her, there was no room for vanity or reluctance. Duty was absolute. Soldiers who entered the canteen carried with them the weight of imminent departure. Many had days, perhaps hours, before they would be shipped to battlefields far across the sea. In the canteen, for a fleeting moment, they were boys again, laughing, dancing, singing with women they had only seen flicker on screens. To dance with Bette Davis or any of her peers was, for many, a dream that softened the terror ahead. Davis, though stern with her peers, showed warmth to the soldiers. She served them with the same seriousness she brought to her roles, her presence at once comforting and commanding. Perhaps she recognized in their faces the fragility of life, the way destiny could shatter without warning. Perhaps she saw in them the same hunger for recognition, for meaning that had driven her since her own youth. Yet even in service, fatigue gnawed at her. She worked long hours on film sets by day and spent her nights at the canteen. Her health wavered, her temper flared, and those close to her worried she would collapse under the strain. But Davis was not one to retreat. She pressed forward even when exhaustion shadowed her steps. She gave so much of herself that President Roosevelt himself sent her a letter of gratitude, acknowledging her tireless devotion. Recognition mattered little to her in this case, for she did not serve for applause. She served because she could not imagine doing otherwise. Still, behind the mask of service, her personal life remained turbulent. The sudden death of Arthur Farnsworth in 1943 left her once more in mourning, a widow draped not in black lace but in iron resolve. She carried her grief into her work, her performances now tinged with a depth of sorrow that audiences felt even when they could not name its source. In Now Voyager, released in 1942, she portrayed Charlotte Vale, a woman who breaks free from repression and discovers love, only to surrender it with dignity. The film resonated with a wartime audience hungry for transformation and sacrifice, and Davis's performance, shaped by her own inner wounds, gave it a truth that no script alone could supply. The war years defined her not only as actress, but as citizen, as leader, as woman unafraid to labor beyond expectation. Yet they also deepened her weariness, and by the war's end she was marked by fatigue. Hollywood, too, had changed. New stars rose, younger and fresher, their faces unlined by battles. Davis, though still reigning, began to feel the tug of time. The studio continued to bind her, continued to fight her, continued to resent her defiance even as they relied upon her to carry their most serious dramas. She gave them Mr. Skeffington in 1944, embodying a woman obsessed with her beauty, destroyed by vanity, and yet redeemed in humility. It was as though Davis, so often accused of lacking glamour, was speaking to the world about the futility of clinging to youth and surface. In playing Fanny Skeffington, she stripped away glamour and revealed the cost of obsession, another mirror held up to audiences who both feared and longed for such truth. Her work in these years, perhaps more than any other, cemented her as not only actress but truth-teller. She was no longer content to entertain. She sought to reveal, to disturb, to hold up mirrors too jagged for comfort. And audiences, though sometimes unsettled, returned again and again, drawn to her defiance as though it offered them a kind of courage. Yet this courage came at cost. For Davis herself, the endless battles, with studios, with rivals, with her own heart, left scars that never healed. Her eyes, though still unblinking, carried with them shadows that even makeup could not erase. As the war ended and soldiers returned, the canteen closed, its purpose fulfilled. For Davis, it marked the end of an era, a chapter in which her fire had been turned outward, consumed by duty. Now it would return inward once more, toward art, toward career, toward the endless struggle for roles worthy of her name. But the memory of those years lingered with her. The laughter of young men, the warmth of their gratitude, the knowledge that in their brief reprieve she had given something true. Perhaps in those nights of dancing and serving coffee, she glimpsed a form of peace that her own life rarely afforded. The door of the Hollywood canteen closed with a hollow echo, and in that silence, Bette Davis stood for a moment, her hands resting at her sides, her breath shallow from weariness. The war had demanded much of her, and she had given until her body trembled with fatigue. Yet when one battle ends, another waits, and for Davis the fiercest struggles often began not upon sound stages or in courtrooms, but within the intimacy of her own home. The applause of soldiers, the gratitude of presidents, the letters of thanks from strangers, these could not quiet the restlessness that plagued her in marriage, nor could they heal the fractures that seemed to shadow every union she entered. Love, for Bette Davis, was no sanctuary. It was another battlefield, and on it she seemed fated to fight endlessly, wounded as often as she wounded. Her first husband, Harmon Ham Nelson, had been left behind years before, their marriage consumed by jealousy and the growing chasm between his ordinary life and her extraordinary rise. He could not abide her fame, nor her relentless ambition, and she could not diminish herself to soothe his pride. Their divorce was bitter, marked by his accusations of infidelity and her fury at his lack of faith. The pain of that rupture lingered long after the ink dried on the papers, a scar that perhaps shaped all that followed. For Davis never forgot betrayal, and she never forgave lightly. When Arthur Farnsworth entered her life, it seemed for a moment that fate had offered her a gentler path. A New England innkeeper, steady and quiet, he seemed to anchor her stormy spirit. Their marriage in 1940 brought her hope of stability, a grounding she had long sought. Yet fate is merciless in its timing. Just 3 years later, Farnsworth collapsed on a Hollywood street, his heart silenced by sudden failure. Davis, who had faced rejection and hostility with unflinching eyes, was struck to the core. She grieved deeply, though she masked it beneath her familiar armor of work. She poured her sorrow into films like Mr. Skeffington, where her portrayal of vanity destroyed and redeemed was colored by her own confrontation with loss. The cameras captured not only her craft, but the truth of her mourning, and audiences wept without knowing they were watching a woman grieving not only a character's fate, but her own. Grief did not halt her pursuit of companionship. In 1945, she married William Grant Sherry, a painter who possessed both physical beauty and artistic temperament. Theirs was a union of passion and volatility, marked by fierce quarrels and equally fierce reconciliations. Sherry, proud and often domineering, clashed with Davis's unbending will. Their arguments, sometimes erupting in public, became part of Hollywood gossip, feeding the legend of her temper. Yet from this tumult came her only child, Barbara Davis Hyman, known as B.D., born in 1947. For a brief time, Davis seemed softened by motherhood. her eyes reflecting tenderness unfamiliar to those who knew only her steel. She spoke of her daughter with pride, dreamed of guiding her into a life brighter than her own. Yet even here, shadows would gather, for the bond between mother and child, though strong in youth, would in time become one of her most bitter feuds. The marriage to Sherry unraveled as swiftly as it had begun. His resentment of her fame, his struggle to find his own place beside her brilliance, and their endless quarrels consumed whatever affection had bound them. By 1950, their divorce was final, and once again Davis stood alone, a mother now but no longer a wife. She pressed forward with her work, perhaps using it as shield and refuge, but the loneliness remained, gnawing at the edges of her triumphs. The pattern of her life emerged clearly. The higher she soared in art, the more fractured her private world became. In 1950, she married again, this time to Gary Merrill, her co-star in All About Eve. Their romance had been ignited during the making of that film, a work that itself reflected Davis's fears of age, decline, and betrayal. Merrill, rugged and intense, seemed at first a match to her fire. They adopted 2 children together, Margot and Michael, and for a time she believed she had at last found not only a partner, but a family. Yet the marriage soon curdled. Merrill's drinking, their constant quarrels, and her own unrelenting will made peace impossible. Their home, far from sanctuary, became another arena of conflict, filled with raised voices and slammed doors. By 1960, the marriage had ended, leaving Davis once again wounded and alone, though she never ceased her devotion to her children. It is striking to reflect upon the paradox of Bette Davis, a woman who could command millions with a glance, who could bend studios to her will, who could outlast rivals and critics alike, yet who found no lasting harmony in the realm of love. Perhaps she demanded too much, or perhaps those who entered her orbit could not withstand the intensity of her flame. She was not built for compromise, not wired for quiet acceptance, and so, again and again, her unions fractured, leaving her with children she loved but husbands who had fled. Was it fate, or was it choice? Did she seek men who might challenge her, only to discover that no one could endure the constant storm? These questions linger, unanswerable yet haunting. Her personal upheavals inevitably bled into her public image. The press, eager to paint her as tempestuous, chronicled her divorces and quarrels with relish. Difficult, they called her again and again, yet perhaps what they named difficulty was simply a refusal to settle, a refusal to accept less than she believed she deserved, whether in art or in love. And though the scars of these broken unions weighed heavily upon her, they also deepened the well from which she drew her art. Each heartbreak, each quarrel, each loss seemed to add another layer to her performances, another shadow to her eyes. By the close of the 1950s, Davis stood at a crossroads. Her marriages lay in ruins, her relationships strained, her career battered by Hollywood's waning interest in actresses of a certain age. She had given her heart to men who could not endure her, and to a profession that demanded more than it ever returned. Yet still she remained unyielding. Love might wound her, Hollywood might neglect her, but she would not bow. She carried on as her mother had once taught her, never surrendering even when the world pressed hard against her. The cigarette glowed faintly in the silence of her home, a small ember burning in the shadows, its smoke curling upward in fragile spirals that dissolved against the darkened ceiling. Bette Davis sat still, her hands steady, her eyes fixed upon the night beyond the window, a queen in exile within her own house. The quarrels of marriage had left her alone once more, but not without legacy. For in 1947, amid the turbulence of her union with William Grant Sherry, she had become a mother. The birth of her daughter, Barbara Davis, known to the world as B.D., was a moment that softened even her iron heart. In the nursery's hush, In the glow of lamplight upon her child's face, she had felt a tenderness unfamiliar to her battles. She spoke then with hope, declaring that BD would know a life of warmth and guidance, that her daughter would walk a path brighter than her own. Yet destiny, with its merciless irony, would one day twist this bond into one of her most painful feuds. In those first years, however, Bette devoted herself with fervor to motherhood. She brought BD into her world of studios and stages, showing her off to colleagues, speaking with pride of her intelligence and charm. To outsiders, Davis appeared transformed, the sharpness of her features softening when she bent to her daughter. Friends remarked upon the sight of her, eyes wide not with defiance but with love, her hands gentle as they guided the child's steps. For once it seemed she had found a role that required no battle, only devotion. Yet even this devotion carried the mark of her nature. She was demanding, insistent, setting high expectations for her daughter as she did for herself. Tenderness was always present, but so too was discipline, for Davis believed that strength was the only shield against a world of betrayal. As BD grew, she found herself at once cherished and burdened. To be the daughter of Bette Davis was to live in a shadow cast not by trees but by floodlights, hot and relentless. The press followed their movements, the public watched their bond, and all the while Davis, though loving, could not refrain from shaping her daughter with the same intensity she brought to her roles. Praise was lavish, but criticism was swift. BD would later recall the sharpness of her mother's words, the way approval was never freely given, but earned only through obedience and achievement. In this, Davis may have sought to prepare her daughter for the cruelty of life, yet perhaps she also sowed the seeds of resentment that would one day grow into betrayal. Motherhood coincided with some of Davis's most celebrated roles. The late 1940s and early 1950s saw her embody characters who grappled with love, ambition, and disillusionment. In All About Eve, 1950, she gave the world Margot Channing, an aging actress fearful of being eclipsed by youth. The role, written with wit and bitterness, seemed almost a confession of Davis's own fears. She delivered it with such sharp truth that audiences and critics alike were stunned. Her voice, with its sardonic edge, carried lines that cut to the bone. "Fasten your seatbelts, it's going to be a bumpy night." Though written for the script, the line seemed to echo her very life, filled with turbulence yet navigated with unflinching control. During the making of All About Eve, Davis met Gary Merrill, her co-star, whose rugged presence and intensity seemed to match her own. Their romance ignited swiftly, burning with passion, and soon they were married. They adopted 2 children, Margot and Michael, adding to the household already anchored by BD. For a brief time, the Davis home seemed to blossom into a family, its rooms filled with laughter and children's voices. She spoke often of her joy in motherhood, her pride in her growing brood. Photographs from this era show her smiling, arms around her children, her eyes alight not with battle but with love. Yet even within this warmth, storms brewed. Merrill drank heavily. Their quarrels thundered through the house, and Bette's own relentless will turned the home into another arena of conflict. The children grew amid voices raised in fury, plates shattered in anger, reconciliations sealed in temporary tenderness. For BD, the experience was formative. She adored her mother, feared her temper, and yearned for a gentleness that was seldom sustained. To be Bette Davis's daughter was to receive love as fierce as it was demanding, a love that sometimes felt indistinguishable from control. In later years, BD would write that her mother's devotion was a double-edged sword, both nurturing and suffocating. She remembered moments of tenderness, bedtime stories, encouragement in her studies, but also moments of sharp rebuke when her mother's words cut deeper than any punishment. Davis, who had fought all her life to command respect, expected the same from her child. To others, this might have seemed harshness. To Davis, it was necessity. She had endured rejection, betrayal, and loss, and she would not have her daughter enter the world unarmed. Yet in trying to forge BD into steel, she may have fractured the bond between them. As the 1950s advanced, Davis's career faltered. Hollywood, so quick to crown its queens, was quicker still to discard them when youth faded. Roles grew scarce, scripts uninspired, and the studio system that had once shackled her now abandoned her. She took work where she could, but the glory of earlier years seemed to dim. At home, she clung to her children, even as her marriage to Merrill unraveled into bitterness. By 1960, they were divorced, and once again, Davis stood alone, a mother of 3, her career uncertain, her heart scarred. BD, by then a teenager, watched her mother's struggles with a mixture of sympathy and resentment. She admired her resilience, yet bristled under her control. The household was a crucible of contradictions: love and anger, laughter and shouting, tenderness and distance. The seeds of future discord were quietly sprouting. Davis, ever vigilant against betrayal, could not imagine that it might one day come from her own daughter. And yet, as history would reveal, the bond between them, forged in both love and fire, would fracture into one of the most devastating feuds of Davis's life. Still, in those years, Davis continued to believe in her role as mother with the same intensity she brought to her career. She guided BD with firm hand, corrected her with sharp words, and praised her with pride that sometimes bordered on possessive. She believed she was shaping her daughter for greatness, protecting her against the cruelties of the world. Whether she was right or wrong, only the daughter herself could one day decide. The lamp glowed faintly in the quiet room, its light falling across the sleeping child's face, and for a moment Bette Davis allowed herself the rare indulgence of stillness. Yet the ember of her cigarette betrayed her, flaring and fading like a restless heart, unwilling to surrender to calm. Outside that cocoon of tenderness, the world of Hollywood stirred with whispers, comparisons, and rivalries that had followed her since her earliest triumphs. And among those whispers, one name lingered with a sharpness that refused to fade: Joan Crawford. The feud that had begun as gossip, sharpened by personal wounds and fanned by studio publicity, was approaching its climax, and the stage upon which it would erupt was as grotesque as it was unforgettable. The early 1960s found Davis in a precarious position. Her once glittering career, though studded with triumphs, was now shadowed by age and a fickle industry that prized youth above artistry. Hollywood, which she had fought and conquered, now seemed eager to discard her. Offers dwindled, scripts grew thin, and she found herself staring into the abyss of obscurity. Crawford, too, faced the same decline. Once the epitome of MGM glamour, she now clutched at the remnants of stardom with the same desperation. Both women, proud and unyielding, resisted the fading of their light. In such a climate, fate, or perhaps irony, placed before them a script that would bind their names forever. Whatever happened to Baby Jane? The story was cruel in its design. 2 sisters, once touched by fame, now locked in a decaying mansion of resentment and madness. Jane Hudson, a former child star turned grotesque recluse, torments her crippled sister Blanche, whose own career had eclipsed Jane's in adulthood. It was a tale not only of decline but of envy, bitterness, and cruelty between women once bound by love. For Davis, the role of Baby Jane was irresistible. She recognized in it a chance not only to return to the screen, but to shatter illusions of glamour once and for all. Crawford, offered the role of Blanche, accepted as well. Thus, the stage was set for a collision of legends, each bringing to the film not only their craft but their long history of animosity. On set, the atmosphere crackled with tension. Davis arrived with her usual intensity, transforming herself into Baby Jane with grotesque makeup, smeared lipstick, and childish curls that gave her the eerie appearance of a doll left too long in the attic. She embraced the monstrosity of the role without hesitation, unafraid to strip herself of beauty in pursuit of truth. Crawford, by contrast, clung to dignity, playing Blanche with restraint and wounded elegance, her beauty carefully preserved even in suffering. Their differences in approach mirrored their differences in life. Davis raw and fearless, Crawford controlled and polished. Together they created a volatile chemistry that electrified every frame. But behind the camera, their feud erupted in ways that blurred the line between fiction and reality. Stories of their hostilities became legend. During one scene, Davis, required to kick Crawford, allegedly struck her with more force than necessary, leaving her bruised. Crawford retaliated in subtler ways. In scenes where Davis had to drag her across the floor, she reportedly filled her costume with weights, forcing Davis to strain with real fury. Crew members whispered about the tension, directors struggled to maintain peace, and the air of animosity seeped into the very fabric of the film. Whether all these stories are true, embellished, or invented matters little. They became part of the mythology, feeding the public's insatiable appetite for tales of rivalry. The irony was cruel but undeniable. Their feud, which might have destroyed lesser actresses, became the very fuel that gave the film its power. Audiences aware of the animosity watched with heightened fascination, seeing not only Blanche and Jane, but Davis and Crawford themselves locked in venomous combat. The line between character and actress blurred until the two became indistinguishable. In tormenting each other on screen, they were also enacting the very drama the public had long imagined between them. Whatever Happened to Baby Jane was not merely a film, it was a spectacle of real rivalry transformed into art. When the film was released in 1962, it was met with astonishment. Audiences were both horrified and enthralled by Davis's grotesque performance and Crawford's tragic restraint. The film was a success, reviving the careers of both women and proving that they still commanded the screen, even in roles that stripped away glamour. For Davis, the role of Baby Jane was among her boldest, a fearless embrace of decay and madness. She relished the chance to shock, to unsettle, to remind the world that she would never fade quietly into obscurity. Crawford, though less daring, gave Blanche a dignity that balanced the grotesquerie, creating a dynamic that resonated deeply with viewers. The Academy Award nominations followed, and here the feud reached another peak. Davis was nominated for Best Actress, recognition of her astonishing transformation. Crawford was not. To the proud Crawford, the exclusion was salt upon old wounds. She retaliated not with public complaint, but with private strategy. Aligning herself with nominees less certain of victory, she offered to accept their awards on their behalf should they be unable to attend. And so, on the night of the ceremony, as Davis sat in her gown awaiting the announcement, it was Anne Bancroft's name that was called for the miracle worker. Bancroft was absent, and Crawford, radiant in silver, swept onto the stage to accept in her stead. The scene has become legend. Crawford, glowing under the lights, cradling the statue in her hands, stood where Davis had hoped to stand. Davis, seated in the audience, her face still and unblinking, bore the wound with silence. The applause rang out, but to Davis it must have sounded like mockery. Crawford, triumphant not in her own victory but in the denial of her rivals, had stolen the moment. History captured it, preserved it, replayed it endlessly. The feud crystallized in a single night, an image of rivalry turned to spectacle. Yet even in this bitter moment, Davis's defiance did not waver. She continued to work, continued to fight, continued to embody characters that revealed truths others shunned. For her, humiliation was only another scar upon her armor, another reminder that life itself was a battlefield without cease. And perhaps she understood, in some quiet corner of her mind, that even this feud, even this wound, would serve her legacy. For what is immortality if not the stories told long after we are gone? And what story could be told of her without the shadow of Crawford at her side? The thunder of applause in the theater lingered in her ears long after the lights dimmed, long after Joan Crawford had stepped down from the stage, clutching the golden prize that Bette Davis believed might have been hers. That sound, so familiar in its rhythm, felt different that night, less like celebration, more like judgment. She left the ceremony in silence, her chin high, her eyes unflinching, yet inside she must have carried the ache of a queen dethroned before her own court. Still, Davis was no stranger to wounds, and like all wounds, this one she folded into the storehouse of her being, to be transformed into performance when the time came. For she had long understood that humiliation, like triumph, could be transmuted into art, and that art itself was the only crown she trusted. And so, in years both before and after that bitter night, she would deliver one of her most immortal roles, All About Eve, the story of Margot Channing, the aging star facing the shadows of obscurity. The film, released in 1950, had been written as a parable of ambition, deceit, and the inexorable passage of time. Margot Channing, brilliant and adored, was slowly losing her grasp upon youth, threatened by the younger, hungrier Eve Harrington, who crept into her life under the guise of admiration. For Bette Davis, the role was less performance than confession. She was already in her early 40s, already feeling the cold breath of Hollywood's disregard, already aware that younger actresses hovered at the edges of her kingdom, waiting for her crown to slip. In Margot's fear, Davis revealed her own. In Margot's wit and bitterness, she poured her own voice. The lines flowed from her as though they had always belonged to her. It is said that during the filming, Davis was at once at war and at home. The set, directed by Joseph L. Mankiewicz, became a crucible where her sharpness could shine. She fought, as always, with producers, with decisions, with the unyielding machinery of studio demands. Yet within the frame of the camera, she was sovereign. Her eyes, her voice, her presence, every gesture carried the weight of truth. When she uttered the line, "Fasten your seatbelts, it's going to be a bumpy night," it was more than dialogue. It was prophecy, a summoning of her own life, a declaration that storms lay ahead. Audiences thrilled at the audacity of it, critics hailed the brilliance, and the role became one of her eternal legacies. But beneath the triumph lay the question, was Davis playing Margot, or was Margot simply Davis revealed? For the fears of age, the bitterness of fading light, the suspicion of betrayal, all were shadows that had long haunted her. The film seemed to capture not only a character, but the very soul of its actress, laying bare the anxieties of every woman in Hollywood whose face bore the marks of time. And in doing so, Davis offered audiences something they rarely received, a truth too sharp to ignore. The accolades came swiftly. All About Eve won 6 Academy Awards, though not for Davis herself. Once again, she found herself praised, yet denied, her performance immortal yet unacknowledged by the statue. Anne Baxter, who played Eve, was nominated alongside her, splitting votes and ensuring victory for another. It was a cruel irony that the very duplicity portrayed on screen seemed to echo in life, with recognition snatched away by the competition of her own co-star. Davis, accustomed to disappointment by then, bore it with the same defiance she carried through all her battles. But the wound cut deep. She had given herself entirely, and once again the world had honored her with words, but withheld its prize. Still, the role of Margot Channing brought her something even more enduring than awards. It gave her a mirror through which generations would see her. The fear of fading, the struggle to remain relevant, the defiance against inevitability. These became not just Margot's story, but Bette's legacy. She had embodied the universal anxiety of aging, especially for women in a world that worshipped youth. And in doing so, she offered both comfort and courage, for though Margot faced decline, she faced it with wit, strength, and dignity. Behind the screen, however, Davis's life continued its turbulence. Her marriage to Gary Merrill, begun in passion during the filming of All About Eve, was already descending into conflict. What had begun as fiery love became a battlefield of voices raised in anger, of drinking, of endless quarrels that filled their home. Her children grew within this storm, their lives shaped by the relentless clash of two strong wills. Davis, though fierce in her devotion to her children, could not shield them from the shadows of her marriage. And when the union collapsed in 1960, she was left once more alone, carrying not only the scars of disappointment, but the weight of motherhood upon her weary shoulders. Hollywood, too, had begun to shift beneath her feet. The old studio system, against which she had once rebelled, was crumbling. A new generation of stars was rising, their performances freer, their appeal younger, their presence less bound by glamour. Davis, though still a force, found roles harder to come by. Scripts offered to her often emphasized age, decline, grotesquerie, yet she refused to retreat. If Hollywood offered her decay, she would embrace it, transforming it into something unforgettable. Baby Jane Hudson was proof of this. But even before Jane, Margot Channing had shown the world that Davis was unafraid to confront the truths others denied. In her later reflections, Davis admitted that Margot Channing was the role closest to herself. She said she understood Margot's fears, her pride, her vulnerability, because they were her own. And perhaps that is why the performance endures. For while other actresses might have played Margot as theatrical, Davis played her as real, raw, bitter, tender, all at once. She was not afraid to show herself aging, not afraid to reveal the cracks in her armor, and in doing so, she gave to cinema one of its most human portraits of a star confronting the twilight. The 1950s closed with Davis at a strange crossroads, immortal on screen yet increasingly fragile in life. Her reputation for feuds and quarrels grew, her career faltered, her marriages collapsed, and yet her legend deepened. For legends are not built upon peace, but upon struggle, not upon serenity, but upon scars. Davis carried her scars proudly, her defiance unbroken. She remained queen, even if her court had grown smaller, even if her throne stood upon cracked stone. The mirror glowed before her, its frame of bulbs casting halos of light that softened nothing, revealing instead every crease, every shadow, every flicker of truth in her face. In the reflection sat both Margot Channing and Bette Davis, their identities blurred, inseparable. A woman who had turned her own anxieties into art. She stared into that mirror, not with vanity, but with unblinking candor, as though daring her own image to flinch. And when she finally rose from the chair and stepped onto the set, she carried with her the certainty that performance was not illusion, but revelation. Yet such certainty, so sharp and uncompromising, rarely brought peace. It brought instead the legacy for which she would be equally praised and condemned, her clashes with directors, producers, and fellow actors, battles fought with a tongue as sharp as any blade. On film sets, Davis was infamous for her intensity. She arrived prepared, her scripts annotated, her understanding of character complete. She demanded the same devotion from those around her, and when it was lacking, her fury was swift. Directors who faltered in vision or discipline felt the sting of her scorn. Actors who arrived unprepared met with her withering gaze. Even crews, accustomed to indulgent stars, found themselves drilled by her insistence upon precision. To some, she was tyrant. To others, she was savior of a craft too easily diluted by laziness. Yet for all, she was unforgettable. Stories abound of her battles. With director William Wyler on Jezebel, she quarreled over scenes, pushing him as he pushed her, their creative conflict producing one of her greatest performances. With Edmund Goulding on Dark Victory, her relentless questioning of character led to arguments so fierce that others fled the set. With Errol Flynn during The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex, she mocked his lack of seriousness, declaring that he was more interested in charm than truth. Flynn, wounded but amused, later admitted that her disdain had stung him deeply. And with Charles Boyer, she clashed so bitterly during All This, and Heaven Too, that their partnership dissolved into silence outside the frame. These quarrels became legend, retold by gossip columnists with relish. Difficult, they repeated, branding her as though the word were condemnation. Yet Davis herself never flinched from the label. Better difficult than dull, she once remarked, her voice laced with irony. For she understood that what others called difficulty was merely her refusal to accept mediocrity. To her, film was not trivial entertainment, but art, and art demanded sacrifice. If that sacrifice came in the form of wounded egos, so be it. But even as she sharpened her tongue upon the failings of others, she did not spare herself. She was her own fiercest critic, forever unsatisfied, forever pushing for more. Performances that audiences adored, she dismissed as flawed. Awards she received, she regarded with suspicion. She seemed incapable of basking in triumph, for to bask was to grow complacent, and complacency was death. And so she pressed on, ever restless, ever sharp, carving her legacy not through charm, but through confrontation. Her sharpness extended beyond the sets, into her dealings with producers and executives. Jack Warner himself bore the brunt of her fury more than once. She quarreled over contracts, over roles, over the very direction of her career. She demanded scripts that offered depth, characters that carried truth, and when they were withheld, she rebelled. Her lawsuit in England had already proven her willingness to fight, and though she had lost, the echo of that defiance lingered in every negotiation. Studio heads, though weary of her battles, also recognized that she brought them prestige, for her performances elevated even their most ordinary productions. Thus a tense stalemate endured, each side needing the other, each side resenting the need. With fellow actresses, too, Davis's tongue carved wounds. The feud with Crawford was the most notorious, but others also felt her sting. She could be dismissive, scathing, even cruel when she believed another unworthy of their position. Yet it would be wrong to see her only as adversary. She respected talent when she found it, admired devotion when it equaled her own. With actors who matched her intensity, she forged bonds of admiration, if not always of friendship. She revered Wyler for his insistence upon truth, respected George Arliss for his precision, admired Claude Rains for his subtlety. With them, she clashed not less, but with greater purpose, for their conflicts forged brilliance. Her reputation for sharpness became part of her allure. Audiences sensed in her performances the same ferocity she displayed in life. They saw not only the characters, but the woman herself. Unafraid to confront, unafraid to wound, unafraid to defy. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, carried the weight of that defiance. Her voice, clipped and distinct, delivered lines with a force that could silence rooms. In truth, she was never acting entirely. She was always revealing some part of herself, and that part was sharp, relentless, and unwilling to yield. Yet one must ask, did such sharpness, though it secured her legacy, also isolate her? For many who worked with her, admiration was mingled with fear, respect with resentment. Friends were few, alliances fragile, marriages shattered. Even her children sometimes bore the brunt of her temper. In giving so much of herself to art, had she sacrificed the gentleness that sustains intimacy? Or was gentleness never part of her nature to begin with? The answer is elusive, for Davis herself was a paradox, capable of tenderness yet so often choosing ferocity, as though convinced that to soften was to surrender. The 1950s and early 1960s, shaped by these endless clashes, saw her at once diminished by Hollywood and elevated in legend. Roles grew scarce, yet each role she seized carried with it the stamp of her ferocity. Her career was a series of peaks and valleys, but her presence never faded. Even when audiences turned to new idols, her name retained the power of defiance. She was, and remained, Bette Davis, the actress who would not bow, the queen who ruled not by charm but by fire. The long studio shadows stretched across the lot as the sun fell behind the California hills, casting the buildings and sets in half-light, a place where illusions were built and dissolved. Bette Davis, her presence still lingering in the silence after a fierce scene, stood in the twilight of both day and era. For Hollywood itself was shifting. The kingdom that had crowned her, against which she had fought so many battles, was beginning to vanish beneath her feet. The old studio system, once the unchallenged power that dictated every contract and every frame of film, was crumbling. Audiences sought new stories, new faces, new rhythms. The glamour of the golden age faded like smoke, replaced by a modern realism that had little use for queens of the old court. Yet Davis, unyielding as ever, refused to accept the passing of her reign without struggle. The 1950s brought with them new stars whose youth and freshness captured the public's imagination. Marilyn Monroe, with her vulnerable allure, embodied a new kind of femininity. Audrey Hepburn, graceful and ethereal, charmed with innocence and style. Elizabeth Taylor, radiant and tempestuous, carried a power of her own. Against such faces, Bette Davis, already in her 40s and beyond, seemed to belong to another generation. Hollywood, always eager to discard yesterday's idols, pushed her toward the margins. Scripts that once would have been written for her now went to younger women, and when roles did arrive, they were often cruelly designed to emphasize her age, her decline, her perceived obsolescence. But Davis was not made for surrender. She seized even these roles and transformed them into defiance. If they offered her characters wrinkled, bitter, grotesque, she embraced them with ferocity, turning them into unforgettable portraits of survival. She refused to cling to fading glamour. Instead, she used the passing of youth as material, bearing it before the audience without flinching. In this, she carved a path few dared follow, for in a world that demanded women conceal age, she declared it with unrelenting honesty. Still, the battles were exhausting. Her marriage to Gary Merrill dissolved in 1960, leaving her once again alone, now a single mother responsible for her children amid a career that faltered. The home she had built on hope collapsed into quarrels and silence, and in its ruins she found only the companionship of work. Yet even work betrayed her at times. Projects failed, films stumbled at the box office, critics sharpened their pens. She, who had once dominated the screen, found herself appearing in lesser productions, her presence wasted. Each failure was a fresh wound, each humiliation another scar. Yet she persisted. She had always persisted. It was during this period of decline that Whatever Happened to Baby Jane emerged, a grotesque gift from fate. The film, as already recalled, bound her in rivalry with Joan Crawford and gave her the chance to shock audiences with a performance both monstrous and magnificent. Baby Jane Hudson, with her smeared makeup and shrill laughter, became an emblem of decline, embraced, rather than denied. Critics marveled at her courage. Audiences flocked in morbid fascination, and once more Davis proved that she could not be ignored. Yet even this triumph carried bitterness, for Crawford's machinations at the Academy Awards turned victory into humiliation. The feud, immortalized in gossip, overshadowed the artistry. Still, the film revived her career briefly, opening the way for a series of so-called psycho-biddy roles, characters of aging women unhinged, trapped in decaying mansions, haunted by madness. Though she played these parts with her customary ferocity, Davis knew the irony. Hollywood, unwilling to give her the complex roles of her youth, now offered her caricatures of decline. And yet she made even these grotesqueries unforgettable, infusing them with dignity, rage, and truth. Films like Hush, Sweet Charlotte carried her into the 1960s with notoriety, if not with the grandeur she once commanded. Audiences could not look away, even when critics questioned the taste of the productions. For Davis, every role was a battlefield, and if the only terrain left to her was grotesque decay, she would conquer it nonetheless. The 1960s brought with them another kind of decline, not only in career, but in health. She began to feel the betrayals of her own body, illnesses that left her weakened, energy that no longer flowed as relentlessly as before. Yet even in illness, her spirit did not soften. She smoked, she drank, she argued, she worked. Friends sometimes urged her to rest, but rest was foreign to her. She feared it, perhaps, as much as obscurity. For in stillness, wounds became too visible, doubts too loud. Work, even when unsatisfying, kept silence at bay. Yet through all this, her reputation endured. She was no longer the darling of the screen, but she had become something rarer, a symbol. Younger actresses looked to her as a pioneer, the woman who had fought studios, who had demanded respect, who had refused to be ornamental. Even those who had never worked with her felt the weight of her defiance. She had opened doors, even if her own passage through them had left her scarred. And in this sense, her reign, though diminished, was not ended. She was still queen, though her kingdom had changed. The transition of Hollywood itself mirrored her struggle. The old glamour dissolved into realism, the polished stars replaced by anti-heroes, the neat narratives supplanted by raw explorations of truth. In some ways, Davis had anticipated this shift all along. She had never sought to flatter. She had always sought to reveal. Yet, ironically, just as Hollywood began to embrace the kind of truth she had long championed, it discarded her as relic of another time. Perhaps this was the cruelest irony of all, that she had been too far ahead, and by the time the world caught up, it had no place left for her. Still, she endured. Television offered her new opportunities, and though she considered it lesser than cinema, she accepted its stages when film grew scarce. Appearances on talk shows, performances in TV movies, these kept her present in the public eye. And always she carried with her the same sharp tongue, the same refusal to flatter or conceal. Audiences delighted in her candor, even when it unsettled. She spoke truths others feared to voice, about age, about Hollywood, about betrayal. In this, she remained unbowed. She walked alone across the fading studio lot. The pavement cracked beneath her heels, the twilight swallowing the outlines of the sound stages that once throbbed with her triumphs. The echo of her footsteps mingled with the hum of Los Angeles beyond the gates, but within those walls the silence of decline had begun to seep. The studio system that had bound her, nourished her, and tormented her was disintegrating. And with its collapse came the unsettling truth that even queens are not immune to time. For Bette Davis, the years that followed were not defined only by fading roles, but by the betrayals of her own body, a new kind of adversary against which even her iron will was tested. Illness came to her not as sudden catastrophe, but as an encroaching shadow. Cigarettes had long been her constant companions, their smoke coiling through the air of dressing rooms, living rooms, and quiet nights. They lent her voice its gravelly edge, its unforgettable timbre, but they also sowed the seeds of her undoing. By the late 1970s, the shadow of cancer darkened her days. A diagnosis of breast cancer led to surgery, leaving scars that no costume could conceal from her own eyes. She faced the knife with the same defiance she brought to every battle, remarking with characteristic wit that her enemies could never accuse her of lacking guts now. Humor became her armor, the sharp blade of irony wielded against despair. But even as she endured the ravages of disease, her determination to work did not falter. She appeared in films and on television, sometimes in roles that reflected her age and frailty, sometimes in productions unworthy of her legend, but always with the same unyielding presence. For her, to stop was to die, and as long as a camera would face her, she would face it back, unblinking. Work was more than survival. It was defiance, proof that the fire within had not been extinguished by illness or time. The decline of her body brought with it moments of harsh revelation. A series of strokes left her weakened, her face and form marked by paralysis, her once commanding figure diminished. For a woman whose eyes and voice had been her weapons, these betrayals must have felt like treason. Yet Davis, ever fierce, refused to retreat into silence. She trained herself back to speech, forced her body to obey as best it could, and when she returned to the public eye, she did so with scars visible, unhidden. The courage of such return startled audiences. Where others might have concealed themselves in shadows, she appeared openly, declaring with her very presence that decline would not erase her. Still, the cost was immense. She grew thin, her movements slower, her health fragile. Friends worried, children fretted, but she pressed forward. She took roles in films like The Whales of August, 1987, where she played an elderly woman confronting the twilight of life beside Lillian Gish, herself a relic of silent cinema. The performance, restrained and haunting, carried with it the full weight of her years, the shadows of battles fought and wounds endured. It was as though Davis had ceased playing roles altogether. She was now embodying her own truth, her own decline, offering it to audiences with the same unflinching honesty she had given in youth. Her later appearances on talk shows and interviews became performances of another kind. She spoke candidly of age, of illness, of the cruelty of Hollywood, her tongue still sharp, her humor still biting. She mocked her own frailty, jested about her surgeries, and reminded the world that she remained unbowed. In these moments, audiences saw not only a fading actress, but a woman who had transformed her decline into a final act of defiance. The body might betray, but the will remained sovereign. Yet even as she battled illness, personal wounds deepened. Her daughter, B.D., now grown, delivered the cruelest blow in 1985 with the publication of My Mother's Keeper, a memoir that painted Davis not as devoted mother, but as tyrant, manipulator, and destroyer of happiness. The betrayal cut deeper than any studio feud or failed marriage, for it came from the very child she had once cradled under lamplight, the child she had promised to protect from the world's cruelties. Now that child had turned the world's judgment upon her, exposing her wounds in public prose. Davis, already weakened by disease, carried this wound with bitter sorrow. In interviews, her voice hardened, her eyes darkened as she spoke of betrayal, yet even then she refused tears. She answered the book as she had answered every wound, with defiance, with wit, with fire. The strokes, the cancer, the public betrayals, each might have silenced another. But Davis carried on, her spirit refusing to collapse. She traveled, she appeared, she acted, she spoke. Even when her body trembled, her eyes remained unflinching. Admirers marveled at her tenacity, critics bowed before her courage, and even those who despised her grudgingly admitted respect. For in facing decline with such candor, she revealed a truth as profound as any role, that dignity is not in perfection, but in persistence, not in youth, but in endurance. There were nights, however, when even Davis must have felt the weight of solitude. Alone in her home, surrounded by photographs of roles past, of children now distant, of trophies gleaming yet silent, she may have wondered what it had all been for. Was greatness worth the wounds, the betrayals, the scars upon body and soul? Or was the pursuit itself the only answer, the battles their own reward? These questions, unanswered, hung in the air like smoke, fading yet lingering. The mirror in the Paris hotel room reflected a figure far leaner than the woman the world once knew. Her robe draped loosely around bones that had grown too sharp, her cigarette trembling faintly as she held it aloft. The Paris night hummed beyond the glass, indifferent and serene, yet within the quiet room, Bette Davis confronted not only her body's frailty, but the deeper betrayal that had wounded her more gravely than cancer or strokes. For illness attacks the flesh, but betrayal corrodes the soul, and this betrayal had come from her own blood. Her daughter BD, once the child she had cradled by lamplight, now the author of a book that sought to unmask her with cruelty. My Mother's Keeper, published in 1985, appeared when Davis was already weakened by illness, her energy consumed by treatments, and the fight to recover her speech. In its pages, her daughter painted a portrait not of devotion but of tyranny, a mother depicted as manipulative, controlling, and cold. The words struck like knives, and they cut deeply because they came not from critics, not from rivals, not from gossip columnists who had long thrived on exaggerations of her temper, but from the very child she had once guarded against the world's cruelties. To be betrayed by her daughter was to face the cruelest irony of all. The very legacy she had sought to nurture had turned against her. Davis read the book, and in its pages she found distortions, accusations, exaggerations. Yet whether or not every word was true mattered less than the fact that the world believed them, for her daughter's voice carried the authority of intimacy. Strangers who had never met Davis now felt as though they had glimpsed the private chambers of her soul, and the picture was unflattering. Interviews that once celebrated her resilience now turned to questions of motherhood, of cruelty, of domestic storms. The queen of the screen was reduced to subject of scandal, her crown tarnished not by her own deeds, but by her daughter's pen. Her response was swift and sharp. In interviews, she denounced the book as betrayal, her voice trembling not with tears but with fury. She declared that her daughter had sought profit, that the memoir was born not of truth but of ambition. Yet even in her defiance, sorrow bled through. For Davis, who had endured betrayals from husbands, from studios, from rivals, this wound was different. Those betrayals had come from adversaries, but this had come from love itself, from the bond of mother and child. To lose such a bond was to lose a part of herself, and yet, true to her nature, she transformed even this grief into defiance. She wrote her own book, This and That, partly in response, partly as a reclamation of her own voice. Within its pages, she defended herself, recounted her battles, and reminded the world that she would not be silenced even by the cruelest wounds. She refused to let her daughter's voice be the only voice that defined her. In this, as in all things, she fought to the end, wielding her pen as she had once wielded her tongue, unafraid to confront, unafraid to provoke. The estrangement from BD left her isolated in her later years. Friends who had once circled her drifted away, some out of weariness with her battles, others intimidated by her unrelenting spirit. She lived largely in the company of her own reflections, her memories, her trophies, and her scars. Her other children, Margot and Michael, remained distant for different reasons, and so Davis, though still a public figure, endured a private solitude. The woman who had once commanded armies of directors, producers, and audiences now sat alone in quiet rooms, the smoke of her cigarette curling around her like the remnants of vanished applause. Yet even in solitude, she remained a figure of fascination. Interviews late in her life reveal her wit undimmed, her candor as sharp as ever. She spoke openly of betrayal, of decline, of the cruelty of Hollywood, her eyes unflinching as always. She mocked her own frailty with bitter humor, remarking that she had grown so thin that she could no longer walk past a window without fearing she would disappear. Audiences, hearing her, felt both admiration and sorrow, for even as she joked, they sensed the depth of her wounds, the loneliness that accompanied her defiance. The question arises, was her daughter's memoir entirely false, or did it contain truths too painful for Davis to accept? Did her fierce love cross into tyranny, her devotion into control? Did her temper wound not only rivals, but her own child? These questions linger, unanswered, for the truth of family life is always more complex than any single voice can declare. Perhaps both women were right, and both were wrong. Perhaps Davis, in her relentless will, demanded more from her daughter than any child could give. And perhaps BD, in seeking to free herself, went too far, mistaking discipline for cruelty, strength for domination. In the end, the book stands as testament not only to their estrangement, but to the impossibility of reconciling love and power in a house ruled by a queen. Davis's later years were thus haunted not only by illness, but by the silence of estrangement. The daughter she had once held as her greatest hope became the author of her greatest sorrow. And yet, in characteristic fashion, Davis refused to bow before this wound. She continued to appear in public, to grant interviews, to act when roles were offered. She refused to let betrayal be the final word. For her, survival itself was victory, persistence itself a crown. There is a kind of tragic poetry in this chapter of her life. The woman who had fought studios for freedom, who had battled rivals for supremacy, who had endured the loss of husbands and the scorn of critics, was undone at last not by enemies, but by love. It was as though the universe, having tested her in every other way, chose to test her in the most intimate, the most unbearable. And yet even then, she endured. Her eyes remained sharp, her voice remained strong, her presence remained unyielding. Her trembling hand clutched the pen, and in its scratch upon the paper was the echo of her lifelong defiance. Each line she wrote was less a sentence than a weapon, forged against betrayal, against silence, against the erasure of her truth. Yet even as the ink dried, even as her rebuttal took shape, Bette Davis knew that her time upon the great stage of the world was drawing toward twilight. The battles of studios and marriages, of rivals and betrayals, now receded behind her, and what lay ahead was the slow dimming of the spotlight, the fading of roles, the narrowing of her world. And yet, as always, she would not accept retreat without transformation. She turned even age, even decline, into art, offering to audiences one final gift, the truth of twilight itself. In the late 1970s and 1980s, roles grew few, but each carried with it the weight of her years. She could no longer play the fierce heroines of youth or the ruthless queens of middle age. Instead, she was cast as women at the end of their journeys, characters confronting mortality, frailty, and solitude. Where others might have balked at such roles, fearing the mirror they held, Davis embraced them with unflinching honesty. She transformed decline into revelation, giving audiences not the fantasy of eternal youth, but the dignity of endurance. One of her most haunting late works was The Whales of August, 1987, in which she starred opposite Lillian Gish, a legend of the silent era. The film told the story of two elderly sisters spending their twilight years by the sea in Maine, reflecting upon past loves, regrets, and the approach of death. Davis, frail from illness, her body thin, her voice rasping, gave a performance stripped of glamour, stripped of ferocity, stripped even of defiance. What remained was the raw presence of survival, the quiet dignity of a woman who had endured everything and still remained. Her eyes, though shadowed, still carried their unblinking fire, though now tempered with sorrow. Audiences watching her alongside Gish saw not only characters but history itself, two monuments of cinema sharing the screen as though to remind the world that art endures even as bodies fade. In playing such roles, Davis offered the audience a final kind of courage. She showed them that aging was not to be concealed or denied, but faced openly. Where Hollywood had long hidden its aging stars or transformed them into grotesques, she revealed the truth with candor. She did not soften her appearance, did not hide her frailty, did not disguise the tremor in her hands. Instead, she made of them a performance that transcended illusion. It was as though she was saying, "This too is part of life, and it deserves its own stage." Her television appearances in these years also carried this spirit. She starred in made-for-TV movies, sometimes melodramatic, sometimes poignant, but always elevated by her presence. Even in lesser material, her craft gave depth. When she appeared on talk shows, she captivated audiences not with charm, but with candor. She spoke openly of age, of illness, of betrayal, of Hollywood's cruelties, her wit as sharp as ever. She smoked, she joked, she scolded, she revealed. There was no pretense left, no mask of glamour. She had become, in her own words, a truth-teller who owed nothing to anyone. And yet, behind the sharpness, sorrow lingered. Her estrangement from BD endured. Her other children remained distant, and she often faced her battles alone. Friends visited, admirers honored her, but the nights were long and solitude pressed heavy. Still, she carried on, clinging to her work, her wit, and her iron will. She attended festivals, accepted Lifetime Achievement Awards, spoke to crowds who rose in standing ovation. And though her body trembled as she climbed the stage, once at the podium, her eyes flashed, her voice cut, her presence filled the hall. Applause washed over her, applause that was no longer for a single role or performance, but for a lifetime of defiance. Her final public appearances carried the aura of farewell. In Paris, where she spent her last days, she attended a film festival in 1989. Frail, visibly ill, she still faced the crowds with regal poise, her head held high, her gaze unflinching. Admirers wept at the sight, knowing they were witnessing not only a legend, but a farewell. She spoke briefly, her voice soft but steady, reminding them in her very presence that she had lived, fought, and endured to the end. Soon after, her illness worsened, and within months she was gone. And yet, even in death, she left behind one final statement. Upon her tombstone was inscribed the words, "She did it the hard way," a phrase at once proud and bitter, ironic and true. For Bette Davis's life had been nothing if not difficult, filled with quarrels, betrayals, losses, scars, but it was also filled with triumphs, with legacies, with performances that seared themselves into memory. She had never chosen the easy path, never softened her edges, never surrendered her truth. She had done it the hard way, and in doing so, she had carved her immortality. The question lingers, was the hard way the only way for her? Could she have lived differently with more peace, more tenderness, more compromise? Or would any softening have diminished the fire that made her who she was? Perhaps the answer lies not in speculation, but in the legacy itself. For though her life was scarred, though her reputation was bitter, though her personal wounds were deep, her art endures. And in the end, Perhaps endurance is the truest measure of greatness. The curtain lowered in the empty theater, its heavy fabric whispering as it descended, a final gesture of closure upon a stage where no one remained to applaud. Bette Davis sat still in the front row of that imagined hall, her frail figure etched against the dim light, her eyes steady upon the curtain's fall. It was a fitting image for the woman she had been, a performer whose life itself was theater, whose triumphs and quarrels alike had been played out before a watching world. And as the curtain settled into silence, another act began. Not one of performance, but of remembrance. For now her legacy was no longer in her hands, but in the voices of those who remembered, those who judged, those who retold. 2 Academy Awards gleamed among her possessions, emblems of victories undeniable. Yet more than the statues, it was the roles themselves that marked her immortality. Mildred Rogers in Of Human Bondage, Julie Marsden in Jezebel, Charlotte Vale in Now, Voyager, Regina Giddens in The Little Foxes, Margot Channing in All About Eve, Baby Jane Hudson in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Each a figure unforgettable, each etched into memory not by glamour but by ferocity, honesty, and truth. Where others had been content to adorn the screen, Davis demanded to dominate it, and in doing so, she reshaped the very idea of a screen actress. Her legacy, however, was not one of pure admiration. For as much as she was celebrated for her craft, she was equally notorious for her feuds, her temper, her sharp tongue. She quarreled with directors, with producers, with actors, with rivals, with lovers, with her own children. The word difficult clung to her reputation like a cloak, both condemnation and crown. Some remembered her as genius, others as tyrant. Some called her courageous, others cruel. And perhaps the truth lies not in choosing, but in acknowledging that she was all these things at once, a woman of contradictions, whose greatness and bitterness were inseparable. For Davis, the feud was not merely an incident but a way of life. With Warner Brothers, she fought for better roles, suing her own studio at the risk of exile. With Joan Crawford, she engaged in a rivalry so fierce it became legend, a drama as enthralling as any film. With her husbands, she clashed until love itself crumbled into ruin. With her daughter, she endured the cruelest betrayal of all. Yet one wonders if without these feuds, her fire would have burned so brightly. Did conflict nourish her art, sharpen her craft, give her the edge that made her unforgettable? Or did it consume her, leaving behind scars that overshadowed her brilliance? The answer, like so much in her life, resists clarity. What cannot be denied is the path she carved for women in film. At a time when actresses were expected to be compliant, ornamental, and silent, she demanded respect, substance, and depth. She played women who were proud, flawed, unrepentant, women whose humanity was as jagged as any man's. She rejected roles that diminished her, even at cost to her career. She dared to look grotesque, dared to be cruel, dared to strip herself of beauty in service of truth. In this, she opened doors for those who followed. Actresses of later generations, whether they adored her or recoiled from her, stood upon the ground she had cleared with her defiance. Her influence extended beyond cinema into the very language of culture. Bette Davis eyes, a phrase immortalized in song, spoke not of glamour but of the unsettling intensity of her gaze, eyes that seemed to see through pretenses and pierce to the marrow of being. Her voice, sharp and distinctive, became a symbol of authority, a cadence imitated but never duplicated. Even her very presence, whether on screen or in interviews, carried the weight of inevitability, as though she were less performer than force of nature. Yet the shadows of her legacy remain as vivid as its light. To some, she was a cautionary tale, proof that ambition breeds loneliness, that fire consumes as it illuminates. Her broken marriages, her estrangement from her daughter, her reputation for cruelty, all became part of her myth. Admirers excused them as the cost of genius. Detractors cited them as evidence of tyranny. And perhaps both were right, for greatness, like fire, warms and burns in equal measure. Davis herself acknowledged this when she chose her epitaph. She did it the hard way. It was both boast and confession, a phrase that admits triumph but also concedes the cost. The debate over her legacy is not one to be settled. Was she genius or monster? Visionary or tyrant? Perhaps the truer question is why we imagine she must be only one. Perhaps her greatness lay precisely in her refusal to conform to the simplifications demanded by the world. She was woman, actress, warrior, queen, mother, rival, survivor, all at once. Her contradictions were not flaws to be erased, but truths to be endured. And in enduring them, she revealed something essential about humanity itself, that we are never simple, never pure, but always fractured, always burning with light and shadow. In the years after her death, retrospectives and biographies sought to tell her story. Some praised her artistry, others emphasized her cruelty, still others sought to balance both. Yet none could capture her fully, for she had lived too fiercely, too defiantly to be contained by any single narrative. Her films endure, her legend endures, her eyes endure, staring back from the screen with the same unblinking fire, daring us still to look away. And we do not look away. We cannot. The flickering light of the projector painted her face upon the screen, eternal in its glow, while outside the theater the present continued its march, unbothered by memory. Yet time, which cinema seemed to defy, drew steadily closer for Bette Davis. The late 1980s found her thin, frail, and marked by the scars of illness, but her spirit remained, restless and unbowed, the same fire that had once defied studios and rivals still burning within. And as she moved through her final years, it was not in quiet retreat but in continued defiance, traveling across oceans, appearing before audiences, enduring applause, enduring betrayal, enduring life itself until endurance could go no further. Paris became her final stage. In 1989, she attended the San Sebastian International Film Festival in Spain, where she was to receive recognition for her lifetime of work. By then, her body was so diminished that friends and onlookers marveled she could still summon the strength to appear. Her face, gaunt and lined, bore the signs of her battles with cancer and strokes, yet her eyes, those legendary eyes, remained unblinking, sharp, filled with the same refusal that had marked her since youth. The audience, rising in ovation, wept at the sight of her, for they knew they were witnessing not only a celebration, but a farewell. Davis, seated in her wheelchair, accepted their adoration with regal poise, her voice rasping but steady as she thanked them. It was a moment of triumph shadowed by mortality, a queen acknowledging her subjects one last time. Soon after, her health worsened, and she retreated to Paris, a city she had always admired for its elegance and its appreciation of art. There, in a small apartment, she lived her final days, surrounded not by crowds but by silence. The streets beyond her window carried the sounds of life. Footsteps upon cobblestones, the murmur of voices, the hum of traffic along the Seine. But within her rooms there was only stillness. She smoked still, though her body could no longer endure the habit without strain. She wrote still, though her hand trembled with each stroke. She spoke with friends, though her voice was soft, her words fewer. In that Parisian silence, she must have felt the weight of her years, the weight of her battles, the weight of her legend. And yet, even in frailty, she carried her defiance. Visitors recalled her wit undimmed, her tongue still sharp, her humor still edged with irony. She mocked her illnesses. She scolded the world. She insisted upon dignity, even when the body denied it. She refused pity, refused surrender, refused silence. Her death, when it came on October 6, 1989, at the age of 81, was not quiet surrender, but the extinguishing of a flame that had burned too fiercely for too long. She died in Paris, far from Hollywood, the city that had crowned her and scarred her, and perhaps that distance was fitting, for her life had been both of Hollywood and beyond it, bound by the screen, yet never contained by it. Her funeral, held in Los Angeles, drew admirers, peers, and strangers alike. They gathered to honor a woman whose name had become legend, whose eyes and voice had defined an era, whose battles had reshaped the art they loved. Yet even there, whispers of her feuds lingered. Crawford was long gone, but their rivalry still haunted memory. BD was absent, their estrangement unhealed, the wound still open. Her epitaph, chosen by Davis herself, was etched upon her grave. She did it the hard way, a phrase at once proud and weary, acknowledging both triumph and cost, glory and wound. Few epitaphs have so perfectly captured a life, for indeed Davis never sought nor accepted ease. She had battled for every role, every triumph, every moment of dignity, and she had paid in scars, in loneliness, in bitterness. Yet in doing it the hard way, she ensured she would never be forgotten. The question lingers in the silence after her passing. What does it mean to do it the hard way? Does it mean to reject compromise, to embrace struggle, to sacrifice peace for greatness? Or does it mean to live so fiercely that ease becomes impossible, that one's very nature insists upon conflict as air? For Davis, perhaps it was both. She could not have lived differently. To soften would have been to betray herself, and to betray herself would have been worse than death. Better to burn, better to quarrel, better to feud and wound and endure than to bow before ease. And so her epitaph is not lament but proclamation, a final statement of identity. In Paris, where she drew her last breath, the Seine flowed on indifferent, its waters carrying centuries of memory. The city, with its stone bridges and narrow streets, absorbed her passing as it had absorbed so many before. Yet somewhere, in the hush of night, one might imagine her presence lingering, a faint glow in the window of a quiet apartment, a thin figure seated before a mirror, cigarette glowing faintly, eyes unblinking. The city beyond moves on, but the gaze remains, eternal, defiant, unsoftened. The lamps along the Seine flickered to life as autumn deepened, their golden halos bending across the darkening waters, soft ripples carrying the light downstream into night. Somewhere in that city, the last ember of Bette Davis's life had faded, yet the glow of her legend remained, carried not by rivers or street lamps, but by the flicker of screens, by the murmur of memory, by the countless voices that still spoke her name. Death had closed the curtain, but the audience did not leave. They lingered, whispering in awe, in judgment, in recollection, uncertain whether they had witnessed tragedy or triumph, saint or tyrant, genius or monster. And perhaps it is this uncertainty that has made her endure, for ambiguity resists forgetting. Bette Davis's story, when told in its fullness, is not one of serenity but of struggle. From her earliest years as a girl who refused to bow, through her fierce rise in Hollywood, through her battles with studios, rivals, husbands, and even children, she had lived a life defined by defiance. She was not content to play ornament upon the screen. She demanded to be force, substance, truth. And in demanding it, she reshaped cinema itself. The roles she chose, sharp, flawed, unforgettable women, challenged audiences to confront complexities often hidden. She stripped glamour from womanhood and revealed its power, its ambition, its cruelty, its endurance. In doing so, she granted generations of actresses the right to be more than beautiful faces. She gave them permission to be human. Yet her brilliance was never free of shadow. The very fire that made her immortal also left her scarred. Her temper alienated allies. Her pride fractured marriages. Her relentless will left her lonely. The feuds that defined her, whether with Joan Crawford, with Warner Brothers, with her own daughter, are remembered as vividly as her greatest performances. To some, these feuds diminish her legacy, painting her as bitter, impossible, destructive. To others, they are proof of her strength, her refusal to be silenced, her unwillingness to accept less than she deserved. Which is truth? Perhaps both. For Bette Davis embodied contradiction, and contradiction is the essence of humanity. Consider the image of her eyes, immortalized in song and legend. They were not soft eyes, not dreamy eyes, not the eyes of innocence or seduction. They were unblinking, sharp, unsettling. They could convey fury, sorrow, cruelty, tenderness, but always with intensity. To look into them was to be confronted, not flattered. They revealed more than they concealed, and perhaps that is why they endure. For cinema, with all its illusions, rarely offers such honesty. Davis offered it always. Her eyes were her truth, her rebellion, her crown. Consider also her voice, distinct and inimitable. Clipped, deliberate, tinged with irony, it carried authority. Even in frailty, when illness thinned her frame, her voice remained unmistakable, raspy yet resolute. It was a voice that demanded to be heard, that could deliver wit as dagger, tenderness as whisper, fury as storm. Critics mocked it at times, parodied it, imitated it, yet no one could deny its power. Like her eyes, it was the essence of her presence, not charming, not sweet, but unforgettable. Her epitaph, chosen with characteristic irony, declares, "She did it the hard way." These words echo like both confession and boast. The hard way meant quarrels, lawsuits, divorces, betrayals, estrangements. It meant loneliness, bitterness, exhaustion. But the hard way also meant triumphs wrested from reluctant hands, roles that changed cinema, performances that remain eternal. Perhaps the easy way would have given her more peace, more love, more harmony, but it might also have left her forgotten. And so, in doing it the hard way, she secured what mattered most to her: immortality of craft, a name that would never vanish. What then is her legacy? It is not simple, not singular. It is not only 2 Oscars or a string of classic films. It is not only a reputation for quarrels. It is both together. She is remembered as genius and tyrant, as pioneer and troublemaker, as queen and exile. She is remembered for her brilliance and for her bitterness. And perhaps that is fitting, for human lives are never tidy, never reducible to one truth. To honor Bette Davis is to honor complexity, to admit that greatness often carries scars, that fire warms and burns at once. Even now, decades after her death, her presence lingers. In retrospectives, her films play, and audiences still gasp at the rawness of Mildred Rogers, still marvel at the defiance of Julie Marsden, still ache with the sorrow of Charlotte Vale, still laugh with the wit of Margot Channing, still shudder at the grotesque of baby Jane Hudson. Younger generations discovering her for the first time speak of her as though she were still alive, still unblinking, still defying the screen. And in a sense, she is, for cinema, unlike life, does not fade. The reel spins, the projector hums, the light flickers, and she remains. And yet, beyond the screen, her story continues to stir debate. Was she cruel to her child or misunderstood? Was her feud with Crawford genuine hatred or the theater of rivalry magnified by gossip? Was her temper the mark of tyranny or of a woman refusing to be diminished in a world built for men? Each question lingers without answer, and perhaps that is her greatest gift. For in refusing clarity, she forces us to confront complexity. She forces us to look, unblinking, into the contradictions of human ambition, love, and survival. Imagine now the final image: Paris at night, the Seine flowing quiet beneath its bridges, the lamps glowing faintly in the mist. Somewhere along its banks, unseen, lingers the memory of a woman seated before a mirror, cigarette glowing, eyes sharp even in frailty. She is gone, but her reflection remains, not in glass, but in history, in film, in the whispers of those who still speak her name. She did it the hard way, and in doing so, she carved a legacy that refuses to be softened, refuses to be erased. She remains queen, not of serenity, but of fire, not of harmony, but of defiance. And though the curtain has long since fallen, though the theater has emptied, though the projector has ceased to hum, her eyes remain unblinking still, staring across the silence of eternity, daring us not to forget.